Let's go back in time to the early 2000s. I said the early 2000s. There we go, that's a lot more accurate. The early 2000s, actually maybe just the 2000s as a whole, was not a particularly good decade to live through. For the entirety of the 2000s, America would have one of its most controversial presidents, George W. Bush. Combine that with other things such as the World Trade Center attacks on September 11th, 2001, and the Iraq War in 2003, and yeah, the early 2000s were not a very good time at all. Now, as we get further and further away from the 2000s, and those that grew up early into the decade, such as myself, we get older and older, it's very important to remember one thing. You don't miss the decade. You miss the pop culture that came out of the decade. And this isn't even just something for the 2000s alone. This could apply to all the other decades as well, to every other decade. I can't believe this needs to be said, but the 80s was not a good decade either. It was a terrible decade. Yeah, the pop culture was good, but that doesn't mean the 80s was a good decade. Whenever I see late wrong generation people say like, oh, I miss the 80s, I wish I was alive in the 80s, it's like, what they mean to say is, I wish I was alive in the 80s so I could consume 80s pop culture when it was brand new. Because for some reason, I'm unable to consume 80s pop culture nowadays in this day and age. Seriously, there are no differences at all between listening to Thriller when it first came out in 1982 versus listening to it now in 2024. It's the same damn album. You're still gonna have the same experience listening to it. Why the hell would you want to go back to the Reagan and Thatcher era just so that you could be able to listen to a bunch of pop songs that are f***ing everywhere still nowadays? I've heard Take On Me and Girls Just Wanna Have Fun so many times that at this point they don't even sound like real songs anymore. They sound like songs that would play in the background of a Walmart commercial. Listen, I love 2000s pop culture, okay? I really do love it. I'm highly nostalgic for a lot of the stuff that was popular in the 2000s, but I understand that ultimately it's not representative of the decade. I know that there was a lot more to the 2000s, and I mean a lot more to it than just SpongeBob and Linkin Park. I mean, for God's sake, American Idiot by Green Day is undeniably one of the defining albums of the 2000s. It was arguably the last really big rock album before the genre just completely died in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And it was an album made in response to Bush's presidency. It was made to criticize Bush. It was made in response to 9/11 and the Iraq War. One of the defining albums of the 2000s, and it's all about how the early 2000s were a f***ing terrible time. I feel like that should tell you a lot right there. So yeah, to make a long story short, no, the 2000s were not just Drake and Josh and Mean Girls, unfortunately. There was a lot more to it than just that. No duh, if you look at a decade from a purely pop culture perspective, of course you're gonna think that it was a good decade. It's really weird to me how the 2000s are the only decade where we prioritize the important real world stuff over the pop culture stuff. For some reason, we don't do the same thing with other decades. We don't do it with the 80s or the 90s. Whenever people think of the 80s, they don't think of the South African apartheid or the AIDS epidemic or anything like that. No, they think of Phil Collins and Back to the Future, as if somehow those are more important, as if somehow those are more representative of what the 80s were like as a decade. A pop star that made one good song and an admittedly classic movie, and that's it. Those are the only important things that came out of the 80s. Nothing bad happened in the 80s. And then in contrast, 9/11 is one of, if not the very first thing that comes up on all of our minds whenever we think of the 2000s. And I don't get it. Why don't we do the same thing with other decades? Why do we only do it with the 2000s? This just makes me really scared that in the future people will think the 2020s was a good decade decade purely because of the pop culture. They're not going to acknowledge the many, many terrible real-world things that have been going on in the decade, and instead they're going to only focus on whatever song was popular in the 2020s, whatever movie was popular in the 2020s, you know, that sort of thing. Even though it doesn't really mean much for the 2020s as a whole. Like, yeah, the Kendrick-Drake feud is undeniably going to be a monumental part of 2020's pop culture, but in the grand scheme of things, it's only going to make up like an extremely small fraction of notable things that happened in the 2020s. There are going to be people in the 2050s or so that will look at stuff like Barbenheimer or Brat Summer, and they're going to think, wow, the 2020s were an amazing decade. I wish I was alive in the 2020s, completely oblivious to the pandemic and Project 2025, and that is something that scares me to no end, seriously. A while back, I made a video talking about Our Cartoon President, a show that ran from 2018 to 2020 and was made to criticize then President Donald Trump. In that video, I acknowledged a lot of different things. I acknowledged the fact that, like, there was no reason for this show to be made in the first place. This was a show that would age like milk the moment Trump stopped being president, and depending on how the election turns out this year, it could potentially age even more like milk than ever before. And while talking about the show, I brought up another cartoon that I found that was similar in a few ways to Our Cartoon President. And so today we're going to be looking at this show. This, my friends, is Lil Bush, resident of the United States. This is a Comedy Central cartoon that ran from 2007 to 2008. It's worth noting that George Bush was president from 2000 to 2009. I don't know why they decided to make this cartoon criticizing Bush so late into his presidency, but I digress, you know? At least Our Cartoon President had the decency to be like early into Trump's presidency. I mean, granted, Trump only had one term while Bush had two, but still. So as I mentioned, the show is supposed to criticize and satirize then President George W. Bush, portraying him and several other politicians from the time as little kids. Now back then, I thought this was going to be the most insufferable thing I had ever seen in my life. I thought it was going to be something completely devoid of humor, my political views notwithstanding. Considering the fact that I was a literal baby when Bush was president, I have no recollection of like, was he a good president? Was he a bad president? I don't know that at all. But much like with Our Cartoon President, I was not going to let the politics of the show affect the way that I looked at it. I wasn't going to blindly say, this show sucks because it's criticizing Bush, or this show is good because it's criticizing Bush. I want to be a lot more fair to the show. So I started watching the show, and it's very different from what I expected, I'm not gonna lie. Something that I didn't take into consideration when I started watching the show was that this came out in 2007. Comedy in 2007 was a completely different beast when compared to nowadays. Some of the problems that I had with Our Cartoon President, I guess, could be applied to Lil Bush as well, but not really to the same extent. As I brought up earlier, I criticized Our Cartoon President for being kind of an unnecessary show. The moment Trump stopped being president, everything about him that was criticized in the show would just be outdated and irrelevant. Yeah, I know about the elections, but like even with that, it still feels kind of redundant in a way to watch a show that heavily focuses on 2018 era politics in 2024. And again, if Trump loses the election this year, then this is gonna age even more like milk. Lil Bush is kind of the same thing, where Bush isn't president anymore, and so it feels like there's not really much of a reason to watch it today in 2024. And once again, this show came out very late into Bush's presidency, so it makes even less sense as to why they decided to make the show in the first place. This show does cover political adjacent stuff from the 2000s. The Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina, etc. The main difference, though, is I don't know how much sense this is gonna make. I know this is gonna make no sense at all, but this show isn't really that political in a way, kind of. I understand. Listen, this is a show about politicians, okay? The main characters of this show, they're based on real world politicians. The main character of the show, the title character of the show, is a satirical portrayal of the then United States president, and yet this show doesn't really feel all that political. When I'm watching this show, I forget that this is supposed to be based on real people. This show has a mostly edgy vibe to it, like it's very trashy and tasteless with its humor, which I was not expecting at all when I started watching the show, and yet in retrospect, thinking about it more, it kind of makes sense. Remember, this came out in 2007, and so this kind of humor was more allowed back then. This show is edgy and offensive, but I understand that it's supposed to be edgy and offensive. I'm not going to criticize this show because of the style of humor that it chose to have. I surprisingly don't hate Lil Bush as a character. I honestly thought he was gonna be a lot more annoying and insufferable, but nah, not really. But there's also the fact that I understand he's supposed to be a terrible character. He is supposed to be a hateable character. That's the point of the show. This show wouldn't work if Lil Bush was this nice, lovable character that was kind to everyone. If that was the case, then the show would go from being an anti-Bush satire to propaganda very easily. I see no reason to complain about Lil Bush being mean-spirited because I understand, yeah, that's the point. He's supposed to be a mean-spirited character. And ironically enough, understanding that he's supposed to be a hateable character doesn't make me hate him all that much, if that makes sense. In general, though, I'm not going to criticize this show for being very tasteless and edgy with its comedy, because number one, this is a 2007 Comedy Central cartoon. This kind of humor was considered acceptable back then, especially for Comedy Central. And number two, this show is supposed to be offensive and mean-spirited and whatever. I understand that. That being said, though, just because I understand that the show is supposed to be mean-spirited doesn't mean that I find it all that funny. I watched every episode of season 1 and I found myself surprisingly tolerating it. Like, I don't think it's funny or good or anything like that, but like, I've seen far worse. This show is nowhere near as bad as our cartoon president. I'll give it that, but to be fair, I feel like besides the vague idea that like both shows are meant to satirize a president, these two shows, they couldn't be any more different from each other, so there is no point at all in comparing the two. But season 1 I found to be surprisingly kind of tolerable in a way, and then I get to season 2 and all of a sudden the show becomes oh so much worse. Something that I will respect season 1 of Lil Bush for is it made me think of something. In addition to this, the Slim Shady Show, the Nut Shack, all three of these shows, they made me realize, damn, adult animation in the 2000s was a very different thing compared to nowadays. I'm sure most of you know by this point that a large majority of bad adult cartoons are Family Guy clones. And even though I've only looked at one Family Guy clone on this series, that being 2021's The Prince, I've pretty much seen them all by default. You think of stuff like Border Town, Brickleberry, Mr. Bircham, Chicago Party Ant, you know, the most bland, generic cookie-cutter crap you could think of. Most bad adult cartoons nowadays are just, they're boring bad. They're not like, you know, entertainingly bad. Very rarely are they like offensively bad, like, oh my god, this hurts to watch. It's just, they're boring as hell. They're just largely nothing burger cartoons. There's a Fox cartoon that came out recently called Universal Basic Guys, and it looks like the most generic thing ever. It's the same old Fox slop that we've been getting non-stop for the longest time. And from what I've seen, this show is not very good apparently, so I might make a video on it in the future. I've seen people express concern that like AI is gonna take over in the future. AI is gonna affect art, AI is gonna affect animation, you know, that sort of thing. I'm pretty sure it already has, because how the hell do you explain these shows, honestly? These shows are all boring and generic and bland and derivative of each other. You know, it's the most cookie cutter crap you could possibly think of. There is no way a human being, a single human being, was involved with the creation of these shows. You could say a lot of things about season 1 of Lil Bush or the Slim Shady Show or the Nut Shack, but at least they have personality. At least you could tell that a human being made these shows. At least you could tell at least one living, breathing human being was involved with the creation of these 3 shows. There is no other cartoon like the Nut Shack, but there are a billion cartoons just like Brickleberry. I mean, for God's sake, the guys that made Brickleberry, a few years later, they would go on to make this show called Paradise PD. And guess what? It's the exact same show. The only difference is that instead of park rangers, the characters are police officers now. Other than that, same show. Cookie cutter, copy pasted, AI generated garbage. Although to be fair, this isn't exactly the advantage to human artists that I'm making it out to be. If anything, I think both of these shows prove that yes, human artists are capable of making stuff that's just as bad as your average AI art generator. But that's beside the point. I kind of like season 1 of Lil Bush because it doesn't really feel like a lot of the adult cartoons that I look at on this series. It feels like its own thing. I criticize this show for coming out too late into Bush's presidency, and yet at the same time, it's so quintessentially 2007. I don't even pay attention to the politics of this show all that much either. Sometimes I forget that yes, this show is based on real politicians. The main character of this show is a satirical portrayal of the then United States president. It's easy for me to forget that because of the way the humor is in this show and how weirdly refreshing it is when compared to a lot of other bad adult cartoons, including those that I have yet to cover on this series. I would rather watch season 1 of Lil Bush over a show that thinks being pretentious is the same thing as being edgy, and a show that thinks swearing a million times constitutes as being edgy. Again, I don't think the edgy, offensive humor in this show is funny, but I don't really have much of a problem with it because, number one, it's weirdly refreshing for the bad adult cartoons that I've looked at on this series, and number two, this is a cartoon from 2007. This style of humor was more acceptable back then. I don't want this video to come off as like me complaining about how humor nowadays is politically correct and squeaky clean and safe and whatever. You can't do edgy jokes anymore like in Lil Bush or nothing like that. Believe it or not, yes, edgy humor still exists in this day and age. It's not the dominant style of humor like it was in the 90s and 2000s, but it still exists. Black comedy still exists if you look in the right places. Do not take this video as me being like, oh, what's wrong, liberal? Are you too much of a woke millennial snowflake to handle real humor? I bet you're trying to cancel Eminem, because that's not what this is all about. At the same time though, even though this show is extremely offensive with its humor, I don't find it all that funny. You can acknowledge that a show is supposed to be offensive and still not find it all that funny. Again, don't take this as me being a f***ing woke snowflake whatever. You can acknowledge a show is supposed to be offensive and still find it not really all that funny. Notice how so far I've been exclusively talking about season 1 of the show and not season 2. Well, there's a good reason for that. Season 2 is so much worse than the first season in so many ways. At no point is this show funny. At no point is Lil Bush a funny show, and yet it's when you get to season 2, it becomes even more apparent just how unfunny the show is. I think the reason why season 2 is so much worse than season 1 is because of the episode length. The way season 1 is structured, you have two 11-minute long episodes stitched together, an A episode and a B episode, which is extremely rare for an adult cartoon to do. It's very common for kids' cartoons to do this, but there are almost no adult cartoons that do this at all. It is very rare. And then in contrast, season 2 consists of singular 20-minute long episodes, which is the norm for adult cartoons. And so when the episodes are twice as long, I feel like it becomes a lot more apparent how unfunny the show is. The edgy, offensive humor that's in season 1 that's surprisingly tolerable, it becomes a lot less tolerable when the episode is stretched out. And even though season 1 I gave faint praise to it for being kind of different from other adult cartoons, season 2 feels more derivative in a way of other adult cartoons. Season 2 reminds me of so many other shows. I don't know why, they just kind of do. This show kind of reminds me of Family Guy in a few ways. There you go. I praised this show for being different from the Family Guy clones, and now I'm calling this a Family Guy clone. That's just lovely. But like in season 2, it's like the overall structure of the episodes start feeling more like, you know, generic adult cartoon fare. When the episodes were shorter, at least it felt like its own thing, instead of feeling like a bunch of other adult cartoons. From time to time in season 2, you have these really unfunny cutaway gags that are thrown in that have like no purpose at all. I didn't watch every episode for season 2 on account of the fact that it is so much worse than season 1, but one of the episodes that I watched, they have these like two like skits in them. Demo Brats is what it's called. It's like these 20 to 30 second long skits featuring caricatures of Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton, and it's like they're not funny and they serve no purpose at all to the rest of the episode. They are very clearly thrown in just to pad out the runtime, just so that the episode could be 20 minutes long. The first time I saw this, I was like, what the f is this? Where did this come from? I don't even care about the politics of the show. This has nothing to do with the politicians that are being satirized. It's just unfunny regardless. It doesn't serve any purpose at all to the rest of the episode. It's just included for no other reason other than to pad out the runtime. To be fair, season 1 does have something kind of similar to this. In a few season 1 episodes, there are these extremely short musical numbers that just come and go, where the four main characters parody famous bands like Guns N' Roses. But the main difference is, though, these songs are often related to what the episodes are about, and that doesn't make them funny automatically, but at least it kind of makes sense for them to be in the episode, and so it makes it slightly better, sort of, kind of. I don't know. There's another season 2 episode that has these letter time skits thrown in between the episodes, and all I'm gonna say is, you will never be him. You will never be him no matter what. Again, it's the same thing. These have nothing to do with the rest of the episode. They are very mildly funny, I'll admit, but they don't have anything to do with the rest of the episode. And the craziest thing is that this is from an episode that I didn't even watch in full. I only skimmed through it to see if it had the same filler as Demo Brats. I didn't even have to watch the full episode to know that these letter time skits had nothing to do with the rest of the episode, and they were only put in as filler. That should tell you a lot right there. This show also starts reminding me more of South Park going into the second season, which it kind of had that feel for the first season as well. This is a Comedy Central cartoon, much like South Park, and I remember going like through reviews of this show, and I would see people comparing it to South Park. It's like trying to copy the same same tasteless, edgy humor that South Park has. The four main characters of the show, I guess, could be like reminiscent of the four main characters of South Park. The I desperately want to be the next South Park vibes could be felt in season 1, but I feel like they become even more apparent in season 2 because, again, the episodes are much longer and it becomes even more apparent how unfunny the show is. And then there's also the fact that season 1 came out in 2007 while season 2 came out in 2008, the very final year of George W. Bush's presidency. The fact that they were near the end of Bush's presidency, I feel like kind of adds to this desperate feel to season 2. How much can we be able to satirize the president while he's still president? Only for the entire show to become irrelevant the very next year once Obama became president. And unlike our cartoon president, Lil Bush was basically dead on arrival since it came out late into Bush's second term. It would have become outdated and irrelevant regardless of who won the 2008 elections. And so now today, in 2024, the show stands as nothing more than just this weird, strange, forgotten relic from the Bush era, more specifically from near the end of the Bush era. Something interesting that I found out about Lil Bush is that it's actually much older than we think it is. The final show premiered on Comedy Central in 2007, but the character of Lil Bush goes all the way back to 2004, starting off as a series of web shorts that were on Amped Mobile, a mobile service that went defunct in 2007. The magical year, I guess. Not only that, but apparently Lil Bush was one of the very first web shows to be adapted into a full-fledged television series. So, you know, support indie animation. Now, some of you might be wondering, why am I bringing up this seemingly important information so late into the video? Why didn't I bring it up early into the video? Well, that's a good question. You see, these amped web shorts for Lil Bush are completely lost as far as I'm aware. Remember, this is a mobile service that went defunct all the way back in 2007. I don't know how many of y'all know this, but the world of mobile phones, mobile services, mobile entertainment, etc., it was very different before the iPhone came along. While doing research on Amped Mobile, I came across this YouTube channel which seemingly appears to have belonged to them. It's obviously a long abandoned channel, and I couldn't find anything from the original Lil Bush shorts, but I ended up finding something just as interesting, if not arguably more interesting. A similar cartoon from the same creator of Lil Bush. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce y'all to Lil Hollywood.
Starring Little Lindsay Lohan, Little Nicole Richie, Little George Clooney, Little Kevin Federline, and Little Cameron Diaz.
Yes, this is a real thing. Lil Hollywood is presumably the exact same thing as Lil Bush, only instead of parodying politicians, it's parodying celebrities. There are 2 episodes of the show and a behind-the-scenes video available on the YouTube channel, and that's it. That's seemingly all that's available for Lil Hollywood. I later found out that Amped Mobile had a website, which is unsurprisingly defunct now, but with the power of the Wayback Machine, we could go back in time to a very different, very interesting time. It seems that Amped, even though it didn't last very long, it was pretty decent. It was pretty big. I ended up finding a page for Lil Hollywood, and it seems like there were only 4 episodes made, so we have half of the show available. I later decided to check out Lil Bush's homepage, and it seems that there are a whopping 10 episodes that are missing. Well, 9 episodes and a behind-the-scenes video, but yeah, I might as well count it as 10. And all of these are completely lost to my knowledge, and considering how long it's been since Amped Mobile shut down, considering the fact that now it's just this weird, forgotten relic from a pre-iPhone time, there is almost zero chance of this stuff ever seeing the light of day, which is a massive shame. Whenever I come across lost media for the shows covered on this series, I can't help but feel weirdly sad. The average cartoon YouTuber probably wouldn't care about any of this stuff, but I do. I want to find the original pilot for Alan Gregory. I want to find the mobile game based on It's Fred. And I want to find the original web shorts for Lil Bush. Actually, now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure this thing right here is a gold mine of lost media. Besides Lil Bush and Lil Hollywood, there were probably tons of other original shows on this service that are just lost to time completely. Not only do I want this stuff to be found for the haha funny memes, irony, novelty purposes, but also just to give like a bit of an insight as to what like mobile devices were like pre-iPhone. Because there is something a little bit fascinating about that, honestly. Just to get a reminder that, yeah, we've come a very long way, haven't we? And there you have it, folks. Lil Bush, resident of the United States. It's trashy, it's tasteless, it's outdated. There is no reason to watch this show now in 2024. I'll admit that, yeah, there's kind of a good reason to watch our cartoon president still in 2024, I'll admit it, but with this, there's no reason at all to come back to it now in this day and age. But despite all of that, there is one thing Lil Bush has that a lot of other bad adult cartoons don't have. And that's personality. I kind of like the trashy, off-brand Beavis and Butthead feel that this show has. I don't think it's good or funny, but it's got this kind of charm to it in a way. Especially when you look at how boring and bland a lot of bad adult cartoons are nowadays. Season 2 of the show is significantly worse, but it still kind of retains that off-brand Beavis and Butthead trashy feel, and so even though season 2 drags down my kind of enjoyment of the show a lot, it's still better than a lot of bad adult cartoons that I've looked at. If only season 1 existed, I would rank this show much higher. If only season 2 existed, I would rank this show much lower. As it stands, I'm putting this as one of the higher shows on the list, but not too high. Again, season 2 really does drag down the show quite a bit. What you're ultimately left with is something that perfectly screams 2007. You could never be able to make this show today because, well, why the hell would you make a cartoon about George W. Bush now in 2024? We've had 3, potentially 4 presidents since then. There would be no point in doing it. It would be redundant. Bet you thought I was gonna say something else, huh? Bet you thought I was gonna say something else. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you all next time. Adios.